Boldwood presents The Children from Gin Barrel Lane, written by Lindsey Hutchinson and read by Charlie Sanderson. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Jack Larkin, get your arse in here now. I heard you, I ain't deaf. 10-year-old Jack yelled in response to his mother's call. Don't you backchat me, my lad, or you'll find yourself out on the street with naught but the clothes on your back. Nellie Larkin shouted, her hands on her ample hips. A single knot set a grimy mob cap wobbling on prematurely greying hair, which could not be contained by its pins. Nellie wore a full apron which, although once white, was now stained and a similar colour to her hair. The dress beneath had also seen better days, and the hem at her boots was ragged and worn. Jack gave her the once-over and shook his head. In contrast to his mother, he was tall for his age, and slat-thin, which belied his strength. His dark hair was thick, and his brown eyes held a constant mischievous twinkle. His old trousers fell short of his boots, and the collar and cuffs of his shirt were almost transparent. His jacket was threadbare at the elbows, and his muffler was old and dirty. His flat cap, however, was brand spanking new, having recently been liberated from a market stall, and Jack wore it with pride. Get on to the end of that bar and get serving. Nellie swung out her fat arm, and Jack ducked just in time to avoid it colliding with his head. Walking to the end of the long wooden counter, Jack surveyed the room. It was packed full of men and women drinking gin, as much as they could pour down their throats. The noise was deafening, as some folk argued and others sang loudly. Women screeched with laughter as people came and went through doors which seemed never to be still. There were no chairs or tables, just a mass of bodies lit by the gaslight chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. The etched plate glass window was obscured from Jack's view as men pushed forward to be served their half-pint of mother's ruin. Jack filled a glass from a bottle on the counter and picked up the coins. A row of huge casks stood behind him, which were backed by large mirrors, reflecting the light back into the room. Serving another drink, Jack took the money and threw it into the massive black till with the handle on the side. Feeling Nellie's eyes on him, he ignored her and continued to fill glasses and take coins. He knew his mother didn't trust him. She didn't trust anyone where money was concerned. But he would never steal from her. Thieving outside of family was necessary on occasion, and Jack had no qualms about helping himself to something he needed, like his new cap. After all, Nellie gave him nothing except his food and somewhere to sleep and a bawling out now and then. But, all in all, Jack didn't think it a bad life. There were others in far worse circumstances than his. Some were forced into the workhouse. More were living on the street. So, residing in his mother's gin palace was what could be considered a fairly good existence. Jack reflected on this as he watched a man, who had been leaning against the wall, slowly slide to the floor without spilling a drop of his precious drink. Gin, the opium of the masses. With a smile, Jack's attention was caught by a small hand tapping a coin on the counter. Standing on the sturdy wooden box that ran the full length of the bar, Jack leaned forward. "Hello, Ginny. Usual, is it?" he asked with a grin. "Yes, please, Jack," the little girl said, passing over her money and a jug. Filling the jug, he handed it to his small customer. "You want me to see you home?" he asked, amid the noise of the bar. "No, it's all right. I can manage," Ginny answered. Jack nodded and watched her thread her way through the crowd, being careful with her important cargo. He knew if she dropped it, she would be given the hiding of her life. "Stop lollygagging and get serving!" Nellie's voice soared over the hubbub of the bar. Jack took a deep breath and closed his eyes tight for a few seconds, trying to hold on to his temper. As he went back to his work, he recalled the last time he had stood up to his mother. They had argued about Jack needing new boots. Nellie was loath to part with her money, even when Jack had showed her the soles he had fashioned from waste cardboard and tied on with string to cover the holes. With the profit she was making, Jack could not understand why he couldn't have a couple of pennies to buy second-hand footwear from the market. He had protested loudly at her refusal to provide the necessary funds, which had subsequently earned him a sound beating. To add insult to injury, Nellie had battered him with the very boots they had disagreed about. With a few bruises and no money for arnica to ease them, Jack had fumed in silence for days. The question he kept returning to was, did his mother love him? Because, if he was honest, much of the time he felt unloved and only wanted for the work he could undertake. Just then, his attention was drawn to two burly men in the corner, their raised voices heralding an imminent fight. Jack glanced at Nellie, who jerked her head towards the crapulous men, and he sighed. Climbing over the counter, he jumped down and pushed through the throng of unwashed bodies, all the while thinking, I shouldn't be doing this. I'm only a kid. Walking over to the men, he shoved himself between them. Looking up at the first one and then looking to the other, Jack yelled, Nellie says to take it outside or shut the hell up. Simultaneously, the men glanced over at the large woman behind the bar and were immediately cowed by her frown. Jack nodded and returned to his post behind the bar, wincing at Nellie's look, which he was certain could sour milk. He heaved a sigh of relief when he saw those same men laughing and clapping each other on the back. He hated being sent to break up fights or disagreements. He could be hurt badly if one of those big blokes turned on him. So far, he'd been fortunate. But how long would his luck hold out? One of these days, he'd find himself thrown out onto the streets with his brains mushed from a pounding. When a toothless old woman called Aggie picked up her skirts and began to sing and dance, Jack knew it was going to be a long night. Early the following morning, Jack sprinkled sawdust on the barroom floor to soak up the spillages, then began to sweep it out of the door and onto the street. The chill of early spring caused him to shiver as he looked around. The Crown Saloon, where he lived with his mother, and which depended largely on passing trade, stood on the intersection between the tramway and Bailey Street, and had been affectionately nicknamed Gin Barrel Lane by the locals. Nodding to passers-by, Jack leaned on the besom and contemplated his surroundings and his life. Dirty cobbled roads, grimy buildings, their windows so filthy they shut out the light. Detritus of all sorts in the streets, which threw off foul odours on hot days. Tramps and beggars loitered further towards the centre of town, hoping for a handout from a kind stranger. There were out-of-work men standing on street corners grumbling about the poverty, some even having to accept the ticket to the workhouse for themselves and their families. This was the heart of the industrial black country, in the centre of England. It certainly lived up to its sobriquet, for everything was constantly covered with a layer of coal dust. Birmingham, a town growing rapidly which boasted a market hall housing 600 stalls, built at a staggering cost of £20,000. Also, built at an enormous cost to the town, was New Street Railway Station, which had opened 3 years previously. Jack was unable to comprehend such a figure, seeing as he was more used to working with pennies. He did, however, like a stroll around the market on the rare occasion he was let out of the Crown Saloon. The bar's name triggered thoughts of Victoria, the English monarch. Then, on hearing the lilt of an Irish voice, his mind shifted to the Great Potato Famine in Ireland 5 years ago. This had prompted a mass migration to the mainland, as many came seeking work. The screech of Nellie's voice broke his train of thought, and with a last sweep of his broom, Jack re-entered the barroom. "Oh, there you are. Stop clarting about and get some bloody work done," Nellie yelled. "What do you want doing now?" Jack asked, feeling exasperated. "That new cask of Ladies' Delight needs bottling and diluting. You know what to do. I shouldn't have to keep reminding you," Nellie said, as she pushed Jack towards the cellar steps. "Are the bottles washed then?" Jack called over his shoulder. "Yes, Poppy did 'em yesterday. Gave 'em a good scolding, she did." In the cellar, Jack began his task of half-filling bottles from the cask, and his thoughts lingered on Poppy Charlton, the barmaid. The Charltons had been forced to accept the ticket into the workhouse when Poppy was a child, and there she had been torn away from her parents to be put in the girls' dormitory. At 15 years old, she had signed herself out, preferring to take her chances on the street rather than live another minute in that dreadful place. She had ended up on their doorstep, all skin and bone, begging for work. Nellie had taken her on as a scullion, cleaning and washing, and before long she had been promoted. Now, at 18, she had attained the position of barmaid and was popular with the customers. Tragically, when she had revisited the workhouse in search of her family, she had learned they had passed away. Jack saw Poppy in his mind's eye, her blonde curls bouncing and her blue eyes sparkling. She was a beautiful young woman, and admired by many who would have willingly taken her as a wife. She could be a force to be reckoned with, too, for on many occasions she had saved him from a beating. Knowing Nellie could not manage without her now, more than once Poppy had threatened to walk out, taking Jack with her. She had made herself indispensable, and Nellie was fully aware of it. Her bright disposition and sunny nature drew the crowds in, but to Jack she had been his protector, and he loved her for it. The thought made him smile as he topped up the bottles with water and stoppered them with corks. Then, stacking them in a crate, he carried them up into the bar. Placing them in their rightful place in the space beneath the counter, Jack returned to the cellar to repeat the process. This particular batch of alcohol was the roughest produced, and therefore, by dint, was the cheapest to buy in quantity by Nellie. Sold as Ladies' Delight, a much smoother gin, the price was the same. It was throat-searing stuff, but if folk were daft enough to drink it, who was he to argue? It was not against the law to sell or drink this foul beverage, and it was up to the individual as to how they spent their hard-earned coin. Besides, this was Nellie's business, and she didn't care as long as they spent their money in her saloon. By lunchtime, all the shelves beneath the bar were fully stocked once more. Nellie had opened up after breakfast and rubbed her hands with glee as people poured in through the door. She had tended the bar throughout the morning, whilst Poppy had scalded more bottles, and their lunch was prepared by Nancy Sampson, the cook, and Nellie's long-time friend. Jack shot into the kitchen for his plate of grey peas and bacon with fresh, crusty bread. He was looking forward to the afternoon. He and Poppy would be working the bar together, whilst Nellie took a nap. It was fun to work alongside Poppy. Her quick rejoinders to smutty remarks made by drunken customers always made him laugh. Finishing his food, Jack stepped into the bar and immediately found his name being called by folk waiting to be served. He smiled. The afternoon shift had begun. Chapter 2. As afternoon faded into evening, Jack propped open the doors, front and back, with cast-iron doorstops shaped like barrels. Slowly, the smoke from clay pipes smoked by both men and women drifted lazily outside, and much-needed fresher air took its place. The sound of a trumpet heralded the rag-and-bone man's passing, and Jack heard the screech of the tram wheels as it drew to a halt. In a matter of moments, people scrambled from the tram and pushed their way through the open door. Standing 3 deep at the bar, folk yelled to be served, desperate for their tot of gin, as though afraid the place might suddenly run dry. The noise was deafening as Jack hurried to attend to waiting customers, and he had only a second to glance at Poppy. Laughing, as always, the girl was working flat out, but was still having a hard time keeping up with demand. As he moved along the line of waiting men, Jack knew it was time to approach his mother about hiring some more help. He sighed, knowing she would balk at having to pay a wage, but the 3 of them couldn't cope any longer. They were all exhausted. The long hours and very little sleep had begun to take its toll on them. Nellie arrived in the bar to be greeted by a cheer from the crowd, and she gave them a wide smile and a wave as if she was the queen. Lowering the chandelier by way of a rope attached to the wall, Nellie lit the gas lights before hauling it back towards the ceiling and tying it off securely. Lighting the wall lights too, she passed a word or two with her regular customers before taking her place behind the bar. Hooking a thumb to Jack, she dismissed him from his work there. His job in the cellar, however, began yet again. Sitting on a 3-legged stool and filling bottles with diluted gin, Jack longed for the day he would be old enough to leave this place. He yearned to be out in the sunshine, on a farm maybe. Here he felt trapped, suffocated, rarely seeing the seasons change or the goings-on in the outside world. Once finished, he went out into the backyard for a breath of evening air. Standing on the doorstep, he leaned against its jamb and watched the light give way to darkness which gradually surrounded him. It was as he turned to go back indoors that he heard a sound which, if he was not mistaken, sounded like a sob. Leaning casually against the frame once more, he waited. Sure enough, a moment later, Jack heard the sound again. It was definitely a sob. Someone was in the yard, and they were crying. Tentatively, Jack stepped forward to search between the empty casks awaiting collection. Following the sounds, he eventually came upon a young girl hiding between 2 massive barrels. Seeing Jack, she tried to push herself further back into the shadows, but was caught against the wall which surrounded the yard. Frightened eyes looked up at him, and Jack's heart melted. "It's all right. I ain't going to hurt you." Whispering, so as not to scare the girl any more than she was already, Jack hunkered down beside her. "My name's Jack, and I live here. What's your name?" The child began to shake, but whether with fear or cold, Jack wasn't sure. "Are you cold? You can borrow my jacket if you like," he said, as he made to take off the garment. The girl tried to scramble away from him, and her sobs rang loud in the darkness. "Hey, it's all right, girl. I promise I won't hurt you. Just tell me your name, then at least we'll be introduced. Once that's sorted out, maybe we can become friends." Speaking quietly, Jack sat on the cold cobblestones and leaned his back against the wall. Jack winced as Nellie Larkin screamed out his name. "That's me mother. Blimey, she's got a voice like a glade under a door." In the dim light from the saloon doorway, he saw a smile creep across the girl's face, and he went on in a mimicking tone. "Jack, fill the bottles. Jack, roll them barrels. Jack, do this, do that." He heard the girl chuckle quietly and swiftly moved on. "This place belongs to her. My mother, the one with the gob the size of England." Another giggle, and Jack felt he was making headway. "So, are you going to tell me your name?" "Dolly. Everybody calls me Dolly Daydream," came the timid reply. "Oh, ain't that nice? I like it. How do you feel about it?" Jack asked. "I don't mind it." "What's your other name?" Jack probed. Perkins. Well, Dolly Perkins, what brings you here to the Crown Saloon? Hoping he was not pushing too hard, Jack kept his eyes on the doorway. Unable to find the words, Dolly burst into tears. Oh, crikey. Now look what I've gone and done. I don't mean to upset you. It don't matter. Just dry your eyes. Jack passed over a handkerchief, which was none too clean. There, that's better. Now then, what I need to know is, will anybody be missing you? 'Cause if not, you'd best come inside with me and have a bite of supper. Dolly shook her head. I have no family anymore. Hearing another sob, Jack decided not to probe further, despite wanting to know more about the girl. He wondered what had happened to her family, and why she was hiding here in their yard. Risking a quick glance, he noticed she was very thin. How long had it been since she had last eaten? Rather than pry too deeply at this juncture, Jack said quietly, I'm sorry to hear it, Dolly. In that case, maybe you should come in and meet everybody. Firstly, this me, Jack Larkin, and Nellie, my mother. Then this Poppy Charlton, the barmaid. Oh, and Nancy Sampson, our cook. What about your mum? What will she say about me coming in? Dolly asked tentatively. Well, she'll probably say, Jack, what you bloody thinking bringing me another sodding mouth to feed? Don't I pay out enough already? What can she do to earn a keep? Dolly giggled, then said, She'd be right though, Jack. So, what's the alternative? Leave you out here to starve? I don't think so. It ain't my way, Dolly, to ignore somebody in need if I can help. That being said, get your bottom off that cold floor and come inside with me. Jack grinned as he got to his feet and stuck out his hand. Dolly grasped the lifeline held out to her and smoothed down her dirty dress. Grasping a walking stick, she looked at Jack for his reaction to her being a cripple. A single nod and a smile from the boy who had rescued her told Dolly all she needed to know. Having a crippled leg would make no difference to Jack. In the warm kitchen, Jack introduced Dolly to their cook. Mrs. Sampson was a big lady with a mouth like a navvy. Her arms had defined muscles from years of lifting huge, heavy pans. Grey hair stuck out in all directions from beneath the mob cap, and pale blue eyes gave the girl the once-over. What she saw was a stick-thin child of no more than 13 years old, leaning on a walking cane. A simple cotton dress, dirty and tattered, hung on her tiny frame, its hem at knee-length showing her withered left leg. Her boots were almost useless, the uppers and soles held together by string wrapped round the whole foot. The girl's dark hair was matted, and would no doubt be alive with lice, but her brown eyes were glistening like molten chocolate. Dolly also had the most infectious grin, showing surprisingly clean teeth. Right, put your skinny arse on that chair and get this down your neck, Nancy Sampson said as she placed a steaming bowl of mutton stew on the table. Thank you, Mrs. Sampson, but I don't have any money, Dolly said as she stood quite still. Nancy harumphed. Then the tirade began. Money? Did I ask for payment? No, I bloody didn't. Talk about ungrateful. The cook ambled away, still muttering, and came back with a bowl of stew for Jack. Sit, the pair of you, before I take that sodden cane to your backs, and I want to see them bowls empty. Slicing fresh bread, she slapped a chunk next to each bowl before wandering away to make tea. Dolly and Jack grinned at each other before tucking into their delicious meals. They chuckled as every now and then another expletive would escape the lips of the cook. Jack! Nellie's voice came again. He's having his bloody tea, Nellie. For God's sake, give the lad a break. Poor little bugger is worn to a frazzle. Nancy Sampson yelled back, and then continued her mumbling as she pottered about the huge kitchen. The two youngsters giggled. Then Jack whispered, "It's always like this, Nancy and me mother shouting and swearing, but they'm great friends, really." Dolly nodded and laid her spoon in her empty dish. "Thank you, Mrs. Sampson. That was lovely." "Good. Glad you liked it, 'cause there's a bloody great pan full there and you've got to have some more." Dolly nodded, her pursed lips holding back a laugh. Finally, their hunger sated, the children sat with a cup of tea and listened to the shouting match between Nellie and Nancy as the former called for help and the latter told her friend to go jump in the canal. Suddenly, Nellie was in the doorway, her hands on her hips. "Jack, come on!" Then her eyes locked on young Dolly. Who's this?" "Mum, her name is Dolly, and I found her in the backyard," Jack explained. "Found her, did you? Well, you can damn well unfind her. I can't take in every waif off the streets," Nellie yelled. Jack glanced at the young girl, saying, "I told you." "What? What did you tell her?" Nellie inquired, directing her gaze back to her son. "Look, Mum, Dolly ain't got any family, and she was starving." Jack proceeded to explain. "Jack, it doesn't matter. I'll be on my way." Dolly turned to the cook. "Mrs. Sampson, thank you for the delicious supper. I'm very grateful." Again to Jack, she went on. "Maybe we'll meet again, Jack Larkin. I thank you for your kindness." Grabbing her cane, Dolly limped towards the back door. "Mum, you can't turn her out," Jack protested as he jumped from his seat. With an explosive sigh, Nellie relented as she heard the calls from the bar. Poppy was run off her feet and desperately needing help. "All right, Dolly, if I take you in, and I ain't saying I will, but if I do, you would have to share a room with Poppy. As for work, you could fill the bottles and Jack would fetch them up from the cellar. I wouldn't be paying you a wage, but bed and board would be in." "Oh, thank you, Mrs. Larkin," Dolly said on a grateful breath. "Don't be getting your hopes up yet, young lady. I want to know much more about you before you get to live in this house." "Nellie!" Poppy's voice filtered through to the kitchen. "I'm coming!" Nellie yelled back as she grabbed Jack's arm. "And so are you, young man. Dolly, you can help Nancy in the kitchen for now." Dolly exchanged a grin with Jack as he was hauled away to the bar, and she felt blessed to have met him. After her mother's passing, her stepfather had voiced the notion of Dolly taking her place, both in the home and in his bed. It was the day of the funeral, following the interment, that Dolly had run away. That had been 3 months ago, and she had scavenged to survive ever since. Now her luck had turned, and Dolly Perkins felt safe for the first time in a long while. The family who might take her in off the street were a little rough around the edges, but they appeared honest and hard-working. She felt sure she could fit in well once she came to terms with all the bad language. She smiled as she recalled her mother telling her it was a trait of black country women to cuss constantly. Dolly didn't care, for she would be eternally grateful to these warm-hearted people for saving her from the workhouse. Should she be allowed to join their coterie, of course. Leaning her cane against the sink, Dolly set to washing the dishes, humming a little tune as she did so. Nancy Sampson watched and thought to herself, "Poor little wench. She ain't got anything but a gammy leg, and yet she's happy to wash dishes. God bless her." "Thank you, Dolly. That saved me a job I hate," Nancy said. "Now come and sit down and tell me all about yourself." Plonking herself on a kitchen chair, Dolly related how she'd come to be in the yard of the Crown Saloon. Chapter 3. So why are you called Dolly Daydream? Nancy Sampson asked. My mum used to call me that on account of me daydreaming about the faraway places, like in the books we read together. Dolly answered. What sort of books? Nancy was impressed the child could read, and her interest perked up. I love atlases best, showing all the places in the world on the globe. They all seem so mystical and exotic, Dolly said with a smile. Did you go to school then? Nancy asked, surprised at the girl's use of such fancy words. No, my mum taught me at home, Dolly said sadly. Seeing the distress that crossed the girl's face, Nancy decided it was best not to pursue the matter further for now. My mum told me my dad died of the consumption when I was about 12 months old, and within a few months she married Arthur Micklewhite. He was horrible towards Mrs. Sampson. He used to hit my mum, and then he started to hit me too when mum wasn't about, 'cause I wouldn't. Dolly's eyes filled with tears at the memories. You poor little thing. What did your mum say about that? Nancy probed. Dolly shook her head and lowered her eyes. You didn't tell her, did you? Nancy was horrified that this little one had suffered her abuse in silence for fear of upsetting her mother. She lost a baby, and I don't think she ever really got over it. Then a few months ago, my mum died, and after the funeral I ran away. I couldn't stay in that house with him, Mrs. Sampson. I just couldn't. Nancy sighed loudly before an expletive left her lips, one casting doubt as to Arthur Micklewhite's parentage. A giggle from Dolly caused Nancy to let out a loud belly laugh. I know I've got a bad mouth, but it ain't no wonder living here with Nellie Larkin. That woman fair rubs me up the wrong way at times, I don't mind telling you. Jack said you were friends, Dolly said. Ah, we are, but that don't mean she don't get on my last nerve. She could make a saint swear, could that one? But she's been good to me over the years. Don't you have any children, Mrs. Sampson? Dolly asked innocently. No, lass. I was pregnant once, a long time ago. My husband, Cecil, was robbed and murdered on his way back from work. They beat him badly and left him in an alley to die. It was all too much for me, and I lost the baby. I ain't had anything to do with bloody men from that day to this. I'm sorry to hear about your husband and baby, Mrs. Sampson, Dolly said, a feeling of guilt coming over her for asking the question in the first place. Ah, well, as I say, it was a long time ago. Nancy reiterated. But Dolly saw the grief still evident in the pale blue eyes, and her heart ached for the woman, and herself. Dolly felt keenly the loss of her mother, but she couldn't imagine what it would be like to lose a child. It wasn't the natural order of things. Surely it was supposed to be that older people passed first. This woman had lost her child even before it had been born. It had had no chance of a life. Mrs. Sampson had been robbed of seeing her son or daughter grow, get married, and have a child of their own. And Dolly felt the heartache as she looked at the woman inwardly mourning her baby. Was there anything Dolly could do to lessen the emptiness she could see Mrs. Sampson was suffering? How could she make the woman feel a little better? Then an idea jumped into her mind. But how would Mrs. Sampson view it? Would she think Dolly was feeling sorry for her? Would she see it as an act of charity? Dolly weighed up the questions in her mind before reaching her decision. Should she voice the notion now, as she might not otherwise have the confidence to do so? But before she could speak, the conversation swerved in another direction, as Nancy told her all about the saloon and its patrons. You wouldn't believe the sort we get in here, she said, rolling her eyes. Their kids are running around in rags with bare feet, but they still find the money for their gin. Some blokes have jobs, but their wives spend their hard-earned coin in here. Dolly listened quietly, trying to understand why people would live like that. "It's a mystery, ain't it?" Nancy asked, as if reading Dolly's thoughts. "They have a house and babbies to look after, and what do? They come in this place and drink that shit, which will eventually rot their guts. It's a strange old world, ain't it?" "It is, Mrs. Sampson," Dolly concurred, and nodded as Nancy held up the teapot. "I always wonder why it is the good die young, and those who care nothing for others appear to lead long and reasonably nice lives." "Well now, that's a deep thought for one so young," Nancy commented as she poured boiling water over the tea leaves in the pot. "My mum told me I should think things through from every angle before I make a decision or open my mouth to voice it," Dolly said with a sad smile. "Now, that's a piece of advice Nellie could benefit from at times. That bloody gob of hers is going to land her in trouble one day. I keep telling her, 'Nellie,' I says, 'shut your trap and give your brain a chance.' The problem is, I don't think her brain works at all half the time." Nancy gave a little laugh as the fondness she held for her friend showed on her face. "I think Mrs. Larkin is very astute," Dolly said. "How come?" Nancy asked, her interest sparked. "Well, she runs a business, a very good one by what I've heard. She works her staff hard, but no more than she does herself." "You'm quite astute yourself, gal, to have noticed all that in the few hours you've been here," Nancy said, wiggling her silver-grey eyebrows. Dolly smiled warmly. "You all seem really very nice." "We am, cocker. We're bustin'." Nancy let out a howl of laughter, which echoed around the kitchen. Having met for the first time only hours ago, the two had bonded like it was meant to be. Nancy set the pots and kettle on the range to boil some water for the girl to have a bath. Clattering cups on saucers, she marvelled at how the fates stepped in when the need was greatest. Before long, Dolly was luxuriating in the warmth of the bath. Nancy had been secretly dwelling on her lost child for some time, and now Dolly had come into her life. A 13-year-old with a crippled leg might just be able to save her from going mad with grief, despite the years gone by. Every now and then, the loss weighed desperately heavy, and Nancy Sampson had often contemplated joining her loved ones in heaven. It was only the love of her friends in the Crown Saloon that had prevented her throwing herself in the canal. Now she had someone to take care of, to love and be loved by, if God saw fit to grant it. Nancy had always adored Jack, but had constantly wished for a child of her own. She doted on the boy, and now there was another to share her affections. Her thoughts were interrupted a moment later when Poppy staggered into the room. "Phew, it's insane out there," Poppy Charlton said as she dropped onto a kitchen chair and began to rub her aching feet. "Hello there, Dolly. I'm Poppy. Jack told me about you. Nice to meet you." Poppy smiled and returned the greeting shyly. "Mrs. Larkin said I was to share a room with you, if she takes me in, that is. I hope it doesn't put you out." "Not at all, sweetheart. It will be nice to have some company," Poppy said, as she gratefully accepted the tea offered by Nancy. "Thank you, but Mrs. Larkin hasn't made up her mind yet about whether I stay or go," the girl answered with a little smile. "I expect Nellie will be wanting a meeting after closing time. She'll want to know the ins and outs of Meg's arse," Nancy said with a sigh. Dolly burst out laughing at the turn of phrase, which caused the others to join in. It was gone midnight when Nellie closed the saloon, her podgy arms pushing the last customers out of the door before shooting the bolts top and bottom. Turning off the gas lamps, she and Jack wandered wearily into the kitchen for a much-needed cup of tea. After a long interrogation from Nellie Larkin, Dolly was told she would be allowed to stay, provided she behaved herself. "I ain't having you and Jack messing about," Nellie said. You'll work same as we do. Now, if I find out you've been lying to me about having no family and what happened to you before you came here, I'll throw you out myself. Do you understand me? Yes, Mrs. Larkin. I haven't lied to you, nor will I. You have been very kind to me, and I wouldn't repay that kindness with lies or deceit. Dolly spoke in a serious tone to ensure Nellie understood she was indeed telling the truth. Right, you girls get off upstairs. I want you up bright and early tomorrow, Nellie said, with a perfunctory nod. Then, with grateful thanks, she and Poppy retired to bed. Come on, Dolly, I have a nightgown you can wear, Poppy said as they left the kitchen. Jack followed suit shortly afterwards, leaving the two women to discuss what they had learned about the young girl found in their yard. Nell, I'm ever so glad you took young Dolly in, Nancy said. I didn't have much choice, did I? What with Jack's begging and you feeding her up, what was I going to do? I couldn't chuck her back onto the streets, poor little bugger, Nellie said with a shake of her head. What I was thinking... Nancy paused, unsure how to say what was on her mind. Go on then, let's have it, Nellie said with a tired sigh. What if... Well, I wondered... Will you get to the point before hell freezes over? Nellie's patience was fast running out. Dolly could be my little wench, Nancy snapped back. Staring at the woman who had been her friend for many years, Nellie couldn't believe what she was hearing. What? Nance, you can't be serious, Nellie said at last. I am, so don't you be poking your nose in my business, Nancy retaliated. She could be lying through her back teeth about having no family. What will you do if somebody comes looking for her? Nellie asked. Look, you've got Jack, but I ain't got nobody. Surely you can see the poor little mite needs somebody to take care of her, Nancy said, taking umbrage. I suppose so. Well, if she's to stay, she'll have to work the same as the rest of us, and that gummy leg won't do as an excuse, Nellie said sternly. She's a game young thing. I can't see her shirking her work, so don't you worry on that score, Nancy said, already slipping into the role of protective mother hen. There's another thing and all. When are you going to tell young Jack? Don't let's go through that again, Nance. He'll explain it all to him one day, Nellie interrupted. You know, if you keep him in the dark much longer, he won't be happy when he finds out. Nancy pushed her point forward. I know, but I have to take that risk, Nellie said with a yawn. I can understand that, but think about it now. He needs to know, and sooner would be better than later. Nancy could see how exhausted her friend was, but continued nevertheless. What about the lies you told him when he asked about his father? I know, Nance, but he doesn't ask any more, Nellie replied, tired at having the same old conversation yet again. Now, the boy needs to know you never had a husband, and the bloke you said died of fever weren't his father. It ain't fair on the kids. Seeing Nellie yawn again prompted Nancy to continue with, And another thing, don't you think it's time to abide by the law and close this place at 11 o'clock? Bugger that! The place was packed tonight. Besides, have you forgotten about the riots 2 years ago when Parliament had to lighten the Sale of Beer Act for Sunday hours? They said we now have to shut between 3 and 5 and close up at 11. Can you imagine what would happen if I did that? I'd have the windows busted and the gin pinched. There'd be murder done. Nellie shook her head, dismissing the idea. The coppers will shut you down, Nellie. The time will come. Then what will you do? Nancy tried again to persuade her friend to adhere to the law. It'll be all right. Half the time the bobbies are in here anyway. Besides, I'm still paying back the distillery for financing my refurbishment in the first place. I know that, but how long will that take? A lifetime, Nellie. I understand they paid to make this place nice in exchange for you only selling their gin, and that you have to repay them. But if you go on like this, you'll kill yourself. Nancy was pacing the kitchen like a caged tiger. It's all I know, Nance, Nellie said with a huge sigh. Hearing the tiredness in her friend's voice, Nancy relented. Come on, let's get to bed. It's been a long and eventful day. The two friends tiptoed past Dolly's room in order not to disturb her sleep. But unbeknown to them, she was still awake. Snuggled up warm in the bed which she and Poppy had made up with linen from the landing cupboard, Dolly thought about the last months of living out on the streets. She had scavenged for food and slept in doorways. Her hand instinctively went to the necklace she'd worn since it had been willed to her by her mother. It was worth a great deal of money, and she had a letter of authentication to prove its value. She could, of course, have sold it and used the money, but something always prevented her from doing so. The necklace had a higher purpose, she was sure, but just what that was, she had no idea. It would all become clear in the fullness of time, she was certain. Closing her eyes, she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first she'd had in a long time. Chapter 4. The following morning over breakfast, Jack asked, "What happened to your leg, Dolly?" "I was born with it like this," she answered simply. "Does it hurt?" Jack pursued. "No, it's just not very strong, so I use a stick." "However did you manage after you ran away from home?" Nancy asked, as she topped up Dolly's teacup. "I begged mostly. I scavenged what I could from the market. I didn't ever steal because it's wrong, and I couldn't exactly run from the police with this." Dolly tapped her left leg and smiled. "Where did you live?" Jack asked. "I slept in doorways or in Park Street gardens. It wasn't too bad, but it was hard to keep warm. A tramp told me to put old newspaper between my clothes, which helped. Then someone stole my coat and bag while I wasn't looking, so I was left with nothing," Dolly answered with a sigh. Nancy passed over more toast and muttered under her breath, which caused Dolly to giggle, the words having likened the thief to a bovine carryall. "Ain't you bitter about it all?" Jack was amazed at how Dolly had taken all that had happened to her in her stride. "There's no point dwelling on what I can't change. It was bad luck, that's all." Dolly shrugged her shoulders before she finished her food. "Well, I think you're a brave little wench," Nancy said as she stroked Dolly's hair. Clean and dry now, it shone like a raven's wing, and Nancy longed to brush and plait it. The beaming smile she received back for her troubles melted her heart, and Nancy was sure this was as close as she was ever going to feel to maternal love. Nellie's voice was heard before she was seen. Boots stomping on the tiled floor, she swept into the kitchen, yelling, "Jack, come on, lad, that bar needs a good clean." Jack rolled his eyes and banged his cup on the table. "No rest for the wicked," he mumbled, as he slapped his flat cap on his head and got to his feet. "You work that boy too hard," Poppy said as she followed Nellie into the kitchen. "He's only 10 years old. He should be in school." Nellie rounded on the girl, saying, "It ain't none of your business, madam. I give you board and lodging to tend the bar, not to stick your nose into my affairs." "Yes, but you don't pay me a wage, do you? So I think we should come to an arrangement about that, else I'm off," Poppy retaliated. Nellie's mouth fell open at the girl's sudden change in demeanour. Usually a pusillanimous person, Poppy's outburst took them all by surprise. "Just where do you think you'll find work in this God-forsaken town, then?" Nellie asked sarcastically. "Somewhere, anywhere. I'll get a job doing something where I'll be appreciated and paid accordingly," Poppy countered. Her blood was up, and she was not about to relent. "After all I've done for you, I took you in off the streets when you were starving. Is this how you repay me?" Nellie was furious. "I will always be grateful for that, but there comes a time when gratitude is repaid in full. Now is that time, Nellie Larkin." Poppy banged her hand on the table in emphasis, setting her blonde curls bouncing. Everyone stared at the young girl, wondering what would happen next. Would Poppy make good on her threat and walk out? Would Nellie concede and pay her a wage for all her hard work? Nancy debated whether to intervene and tell them both to quit arguing, but she didn't think it was her place to speak out. However, it was Jack who finally spoke up and broke the impasse. "Mum, it's only fair. Poppy works hard and long hours in that bar, same as you and me." Nellie glanced at her son, angry that he had taken the side of the barmaid over that of his mother. "A maid earns about £6 a year, and what do I get? Bed and board, and I work a sight harder than a maid," Poppy went on. £6 a year? You're joking, ain't you? Nellie snorted. "What about Nancy? What'd you pay her? About £11 a year would be my guess," continued Poppy. "Don't you be dragging me into this, young lady," Nancy said, all thoughts of trying to quell the argument now gone. "Stop it, all of you," Jack yelled, making Dolly jump out of her skin. "This is getting us nowhere. Mum, Poppy deserves a wage of some sort, so work it out with her. Me and Dolly will go and fill the